I told Andrew about the same time in the early 60s, my dad was a technical writer for Howard Hughes. He was a geophysicist by training. I mean, Hughes had thousands of employees, but share the story of Howard Hughes, how the powers that be can fake anybody's death and keep them alive out of sight, if you would. I thought that was fascinating.
Well, in the 1983 timeframe, 82, 83 timeframe, I don't have specific dates because, again, these experiences were 30 years ago. I was instructed not to make diary entries or take notes about what we were doing. It was highly classified. We could actually potentially be eliminated if we did something that harmed operational security. So I'm working from memory. But in the 1982-83 timeframe, when I was really going there frequently, there was an incident in which my fellow jumper, Bernard Mendez, collapsed, probably from hypoxia, on the Martian surface. I was about a mile from the closest jump room. And I looked down at his body. I checked. I could see that he was breathing. I found a pulse. And I said, I'm either going to save Bernie and carry him into the jump room, or he's going to be eaten here by one of the predator species. There were about 6 or 7 carnivores, 2 of which were inevitably lethal if you were anywhere around them and they wanted to make lunch of you. So I did a fireman's carry. I was about 180 pounds, and in the peak of my health as a young man. I was 21, 22 years old in peak condition. I wasn't certainly not an athlete, but I was physically fit. And I put him over my right shoulder and carried him in, actually dropping him on the ground a few times. And when I finally got back to the jump room that we called the corkscrew, because it had kind of a conch shell, sort of Fibonacci-based structure, a kind of a spiral structure, I actually was almost falling over myself, and I kind of tumbled Bernard into the floor of the jump room, and I said, I don't know whether he's still alive. He was out in the field. Get him home. And Bernie ended up waking up in a Los Angeles hospital, probably Daniel Freeman there near Marina del Rey, near the jump room building. And as a result, somebody that Mendez knew from the 1970s, who Richard Nixon had asked to find, Hughes, that is to say that Mendez had been selected by Nixon and had been looking for Hughes after his alleged death in April of 1976. You may recall that there was a picture drawn of an emaciated, sort of demented Howard Hughes who died in a terrible condition while flying into Houston, Texas in April of 1976. Well, as a result of my rescue of Mendez, somebody that Hughes had known for many years, Mr. Hughes, who was still quite alive and had an office on the 4th floor of that building in El Segundo, where the West Coast jump room to Mars was, asked to meet me. And I was walked into his office, and he said, oh, this is Andy? Are you Andy? Oh, hi, Andy. Howard Hughes. And because I was a bright, well-read teenager and college student, I had read all the accounts of the Howard Hughes with long hair and fingernails and peeing in mason jars while eating black walnut ice cream or watching Ice Station Zebra over and over again on a movie screen. So I knew Howard Hughes to be deceased. Well, he wasn't. Howard Hughes' death was faked in 1976 to protect him from assassination or abduction when he was working on sensitive defense technical projects linked to the CIA. Those projects included the Glomar Explorer, which was an advanced submersible that would lift a Soviet submarine off the floor of the Pacific Ocean, and did, and the Mars Jump Room device and the program to send American astronauts there. I only later, when I compared notes with my fellow jumper William Whitecrow, and then had the opportunity to discuss Howard Hughes' survival after 1976. In fact, he died at age 93 in 2001, as established by the recent biographers of Hughes, who I spoke with and have done several radio shows with, Douglas Wellman, a former dean at USC, and Army Major General Mark Music. They have documented the fact that Hughes survived. And Whitecrow and I have been able to corroborate their research by saying, look, we interacted with Hughes at the El Segundo Jump Room building. Now, I went into his office maybe 3 or 4 times. He was very, very courteous and friendly in that initial meeting. But as I've described to Music and to Wellman, who are well aware of his bipolar trait, several other times when I went into Mr. Hughes' office, he was being brutal to his staff. He was basically in the negative phase of bipolar disorder and being extremely unkind to his staff. So he had this duality in his personality. But it was Hughes, and he was identified to me as Mr. Hughes. I just didn't appreciate the whole time I was on the program that it was Howard Hughes. But now we've corroborated that fact. And in fact, Hughes was a guest of honor by the leading staff of Project Pegasus at the one of the most popular Mexican restaurants in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I don't know if it's still there, but the Brown family owned it. It was called La Hacienda in Old Town Albuquerque. I think it may still be there. And when I was a child on the project in 1970, there was a rumor that there was going to be a VIP at lunch at the La Hacienda that day. And I asked my father what a VIP meant, and he explained, a very important person. I asked who the person was going to be, and he wouldn't tell me. I think they were keeping it secret. I then asked my dad's longtime friend and sometimes companion, Mary Constance Chavez, Connie, or she was also known as Pilly Chavez, who was the cashier at the La Hacienda, who this VIP was. And she whispered heatedly, sort of urgently in my ear, and explained who Howard Hughes was. So Hughes was a guest of honor. He was briefed on our time travel technologies at the La Hacienda restaurant in 1970. Well, Wellman and music have established that when he went back to his girlfriend, Eva McClellan, in their double wide outside of Montgomery, Alabama, Howard Hughes had kind of forsaken wealth accumulation and was living a very simple lifestyle with a lot of his basic clothing and so forth kept in these plastic boxes in their yard. That's why they've named their biography of the real Hughes, Boxes, The Secret Life of Howard Hughes. Well, they've stated that in 1970, when he went back to stay with McClellan, essentially his third wife, she asked him, Howard, where have you been and with who? And he said, somewhere else in the country with stargazers. That's how Eva McClellan remembered it when she was interviewed by these biographers. But I said, no, that's not what he said. He probably said stargaters, because 2 years later, in Project Pegasus, stargates emerged that we were using to jump from 1972 to the year 2045. So I think that Hughes was coining a phrase to sort of disguise from his third wife the fact that he'd been briefed on the time travel program. So I had actually been at a lunch that Hughes was a guest of honor at as a child on the project, and then had the privilege of meeting this great American when I was college age, and I was not just jumping across Earth, but jumping off planet utilizing a time travel technology. So the Mars cover-up is part of the cover-up of the true life and career of Howard Robart Hughes.
Would you also explain how, because this has been a question, I mean, it's always talked about, and you help me to understand it, how even when you go into the past or jump into the past or, forward into the future, that you can't affect the outcome if just explain that, because, it's really a hard thing to wrap around your brain around, but yet when you do, it's really simple. Go ahead and explain that. In essence, why someone couldn't go back, and then I'll let you, if we've got time, to go into that you were shown the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus. And again, ladies and gentlemen, you're getting the feeling that Andrew Basiago knows what he's talking about, and the details are so concise that he would stand any cross interrogation. But will you share that, why you can't affect the outcome of history? Because if they could, they'd go back, and try and kill Jesus, stop him. Now, obviously, as God's son, they couldn't do it.
Yeah, Steve, this is an area where sort of the semiotics of language really matters. So let me be clear. A time traveler from the future who goes back to the past can affect events. They're not just, having a null effect on events. What they can't do is change what happened from the perspective of the present, which was the past's future. The reason in physics, and then I'll explain in practical terms, in the language of physics, when in the present a present event undergoes the so-called collapse of the wave function, that present event is transmuted into a past event that is a fixed element in the time-space continuum. In practical language, what I'm saying is that when a time traveler from the future goes back to the past, they can affect what happens there, or they cannot. They can either have no effect or an effect. For example, by jumping from spring of 1972 via a device called a plasma confinement chamber, I was sent back to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania the day that Lincoln spoke there, which was November 19th of 1863, and was photographed there in the so-called Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln Gettysburg. I'm the boy standing in the center, the near ground, foreground of that photograph. So by going back, I retrocausally placed my presence there that day and was photographed. So I affected the events of that day, the day that Lincoln gave his famous Gettysburg Address. But from the perspective of the future, you can't go back and change the past because the events there are deeply embedded in the time-space continuum. And another practical constraint is when you time travel to the past and are there in the present, you're having present effects on the original event. So you can't change what's happening. You can only contribute to it. You can only affect it, if at all. Okay? Does that make more sense? It's hard to wrap our minds around because we learn linear causation from the time that we're infant. And it's hard to understand events that are retrocausally caused, where essentially the cause follows the effect. So by going back to the time traveler, I was there on November 19th, 1863, and I didn't create a second version of that day in Gettysburg. I contributed or affected that day, the events of that particular day in history, the day Lincoln spoke there. So by going back, I didn't change that event just because I was from the future any more than if I had ridden the train from Washington with Lincoln. Okay? I got there at that moment in time space from the future, but in a causal relationship to present events that was indistinguishable from somebody of that time who didn't time travel there. So another practical consideration of that is that anybody who does time travel to the past has whatever effect they can in the past present. So it's impossible to change the events that go on there from the perspective of history because time is linear and because the causal effects you have are already embedded in the event. In that sense, you can only go back in time to fulfill what history knows you did. Okay? Now, in the case of the film footage of Jesus, who was a real historical figure, he was a real human being, I'll leave it to people's own sense of faith and conscience to determine whether or not he was the Son of God and our Savior, as I have accepted. And I'm not hiding that fact that I'm a believer with an IQ of 168. Okay? So not all. We cannot try to discredit Christian faith by attacks on believers. I've got the IQ to analyze this, and I've determined that Scripture is revealed truth and that Jesus is our Savior. But I did not see his resurrection. I only learned of it from my father. What I did see was a 20 to 30 minute film of a hologram generated by a device called a chronovisor that showed the actual crucifixion of the actual Jesus. And I can say, as somebody who was then a Catholic Sunday school child, that the actual crucifixion of Jesus was entirely in accord with the gospel account, including things like the crown, Jesus' emaciated condition, the crown of thorns, the fact that he was nailed through the wrists and feet, the sign above his head, the fact that the Roman centurion Longinus took the top end of his spear and lunged upward on one leg to pierce Jesus' side, the fact that women came to pray at the foot of his cross, the fact that there were two men being crucified behind him at different angles, and that even that the sky grew dark at a certain point in his crucifixion. And I have to tell you, I had never seen anybody's killing, certainly as, a public school kid from New Jersey. I was 10 and a half years old, but it was extremely harrowing. That's the word I was trying to seek yesterday. It was harrowing to watch a film of a hologram of Jesus' execution. Now, what then happened is when we walked outside, my father then explained to Connie Chavez and I, who was the other guest that he invited to to that viewing that his team also recovered moving holographic images of a scene 3 days later in which there was a flash of light in Jesus' crypt. Jesus, two angels appeared, not one as some of the Gospels say, but 2 angels appeared. Jesus stood up and all 3 of them pushed the stone away from the opening of the crypt, and the 3 of them walked out of Jesus' crypt. So I have to bear witness to what my father told me. He was a believer himself. He was a man of truth and honor, and he never would have informed an old friend who was such an earnest believer as Connie Chavez, or his number 5 child, his number 3 son, as he used to call me. That's how he identified me to Harold Agnew. Here's Andrew, my number 3 son. He never would have deceived me. He would never have deceived anybody, much less one of his children, about the fact that his team also recovered moving holographic images of the resurrection. So I'm posing this information to the public because I learned it, because it would be disingenuous not to reveal what my father told me, and also for us to ponder the consideration. Given the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment, we have to ask whether our government has actually concealed Jesus' resurrection to not establish or prohibit the free exercise of either Christianity or non-Christian religions. I think a political and perhaps even a religiously advised decision was made to conceal this footage. Perhaps the Vatican informed the U.S. government, don't show it. People should come to Jesus through faith, not through movies. But that's what happened. I didn't see the footage of the resurrection, but I learned of it from my dad, and I believe he was telling the truth.
Well, you could also postulate another answer, that obviously the evil that has been personified in specific, really evil people on the planet and behind the scenes of the secret societies, they're the ones that blocked it, and it wasn't for a constitutional issue, but for a later, if you will, manifestation of what the Bible would call the Antichrist, he who takes the place of Jesus Christ. And I would say this, the sinister nature of all the wars that have been fought and everything contrary to the word and the character of God are seemingly being controlled. You spoke about the bankers and their blood sacrifice, their cannibalism, their allegiance to Lucifer. That's what Jesus, I think, meant when he said the love of money is the root of all evil. Not the money itself, but the love of it. And money to them is power, but the power only achieves a specific, if you will, lowerarchy in Satan's hell that's still on earth. So I would just say this, my response to what you just said, I don't think it was a matter of, quote, conscience or even the Constitution. I believe that obviously, and I think there are enough people who are Catholic theologians who have been murdered, Malachi Martin being a preeminent one. People try and dismiss him, but now you see the war in the Catholic Church where the Pope has just absolutely abdicated, or not abdicated, but basically passed his decree that there is no heaven, there is no hell, Jesus isn't the only way to the Father, and that everybody's going to live in a giant tent and all are welcome. So I would say this, the technology that you are describing would obviously been utilized just as you guys utilized it for one purpose. Obviously, evil had its way. A multi-star general with more stars, and I'll be kind of vague here, that most people know exists, told me that Majestic 12 was split into 2 factions. The Magi, which were the good guys, and the magicians, which were the bad guys. And, you know, it matches up with biblical truth. It matches up with Cain and Abel. It matches up with everything that we see. There's always the, quote, presence of free will. So I would just encourage, you know, everyone to think about this and pray about it. By the way, Andrew, I've always told everybody, I think you've heard me before, take this stuff to the Lord in prayer, because it's going to be so hard for people to wrap their heads around this. But again, ladies and gentlemen, independent of Andrew Bashago, I have 5 people known to me, some of them are very close, one of them's dead now, that have gone into such excruciating detail that the only way, and Doug, you'll basically know this, that's why you sequester witnesses so they don't take other guys' stuff, but who completely validate what Andrew is telling you tonight. And we can't cover the whole thing, Andrew, tonight, but I want to thank you because, again, you have so many pieces of the puzzle, and I believe right now God is taking that piece of Mars and putting it into the greater framework, and I think that people are going to be, their minds are going to be blown, and I see kind of what I've tried to do in talk radio for 25 years is to prepare people for the greatest, if you will, mind melt that they're going to encounter, and that's why I think that, you know, again, over the years, you've had reception, but you've also had ridicule, you've been mocked, you've been, and by a certain individual, I won't name him, but even the torture you were, subjected to was done by someone who supposedly sees the future. I'll leave it at that. So the point is that, ladies and gentlemen, I want to encourage you that you're listening. We're blessed to listen to somebody who has an inside knowledge. And again, 1 week ago today, I got a call, and they basically said what Dr. Basiago is saying. This is what they're stating. Thank you so much, Andrew.
Yeah, thanks. You know, when John Glenn returned to the Earth after orbiting around it, he was given a ticker tape parade in New York City, down through the boulevards of New York City. I'm an American astronaut as well, and I actually went farther more frequently. And I've been accused wrongly of atrocity. So that's an aspect of the fulfillment, for example, of the biblical prophecy that the ways of men shall wax worse and worse. We have been persecuting our space heroes to perpetuate these cover-ups, and I haven't just been faulted or mocked. I've been wrongfully accused of committing atrocities. So I just want to end on that note. I also want to thank you personally. Steve Quayle, you are a prince among men, and you have an incredibly advanced level of insight to support me over the years, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart.